Okay, so I want to talk about neural pathways and how we store trauma and why it's so dangerous just to talk about trauma all the time, versus actually starting with looking at strategies, but then also starting to reframe and find the way out. So when you know how neural pathways work and how the brain stores memories, you know that it stores it along a series of synapses. There's synaptic links and neural pathways. Your brain looks like tree roots or seaweed roots, and that's how it stores everything. And then the electrons fire each other off and they make connections. So this is like this. So that lavender smell is like my grandmother's perfume drawer or whatever, right? So then you start to link and make connections, and then it's a whole other talk about why dementia is a lack of electrodes and psilocybin and nutrients and brain and nutrients and hydration in the brain. But that's another talk for another day. Right, so psychiatrists specifically and other people who have, like me, studied for years psychoneuroimmunology or brain chemistry or how the brain stores trauma in detail, you know that talking about trauma over and over again will trigger a biochemical reaction in your body, and it's literally like you're reliving the same trauma. And so that's when clients get adrenal fatigue. So a psychiatrist, for a start, because the person is reliving the trauma over and over again, they'll prescribe medication, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, like Zoloft or Pristiq or one of those, or Valium or any of those that are. But if you're living in extreme trauma, you're not producing. So serotonin reuptake inhibitors flood the brain with low-level serotonin and literally don't suck it back up, don't reabsorb it. The problem is if you're living in trauma, you're not producing serotonin in the first place. And if you're eating comfort foods versus nourishing foods, if you have depression, you're not eating wholesome foods, you're not creating serotonin. So to have the tryptophan in your body, you're not running out and doing exercise, and so you're not creating endorphins, right? You're not, so it becomes this vicious cycle. That's why things like Zoloft stop working, and they test them. When they test these medicines, they're testing them on people who don't have depression, usually, or they're testing them on people who have low-level depression. And then at some point they stop working if your body's not produced, if you've got a dopamine deficiency or a serotonin deficiency. So ideally, if someone is experiencing trauma, what you want to do is help their brain make new connections to start to look for a solution. So Tony Robbins does the most basic version of this, where he says, if you're always asking, why am I so hopeless? Why do I always attract this? Your brain will look for connections for the problem, right? It'll reinforce and embed the problem further and find more legs for the platform of hopeless or depressed, versus if you say, how can I solve this? Then you'll start looking for solutions and you'll start resonating and wanting to be around people who have found the solution and asking people who have found the solution, rather than wanting to be around people who misery loves company sort of energy. Now, but that's only if you're in the place where you're able to dig yourself out of the hole. The sad thing is, if you're going to any sort of therapist, be them a new age therapist, a psychotherapist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, anyone who isn't helping you find strategies, find new meaning, reframe, create new stories, do the Byron Katie thing of completely reframing the story, which when you reframe the story, your brain makes different connections. It'll make connections to more positive things, which will have a biochemical response in neuropeptides, strengthening your immune system, making you feel more positive. But if you're going to someone who is just, getting you to spend the whole session, going into the trauma, this week I spoke to a woman who's a therapist, and she complained that all of her clients continually bitch and moan, and that's because they're not spiritual and they're not taking ownership. And she said all of her clients complain. So I asked her to give me an example of how she does a session. And she started off right at the start getting them to completely feel into and amplify and immerse themselves in the feeling of the trauma they'd experienced. And then she doesn't really do anything with it. And I thought, oh my God, not only is that dangerous because she's a psychologist, she's not giving them medication to help them handle all the extreme trauma that she's telling them to turn on and amplify, which is incredibly dangerous and kind of unethical. But she means well. But what it's doing is the person is then reliving. So you know that humans do this. We know that we do this because if you smell certain cookies, you're taken right back to Christmas when you were 4 years old. So we know how our brain works, but yet how have we not made the leap that talking about trauma is going to put us in trauma the same way that we fully cognizant of the fact that talking about a happy memory brings us joy? And why do we think that we're going to somehow find the solution if talking about a painful memory brings us pain? So why do we keep doing this? I mean, psychiatrists know how neural pathways work. We know how psychoneuroimmunology works, which, by the way, is the biological and emotional response to memories. And Dr. Bruce Lipton has some great videos and books online for free about neuropeptides and about the genes that turn off your immune system if you're depressed. It's suppress, depress, and then express. You know, literally you have a biochemical reaction because your body is running on your unconscious programming. So you can't override it. You can't force yourself to be happy. You can't just pretend. You can't shove it down and pretend. If you shove things down, it causes the places in your body that hold that tension are the spleen and the kidney specifically. There's a whole lot of reasons why, but it's not only where your body holds the tension. It's, you know, there's such a huge correlation between the emotion and the disease. And that's because certain emotions like anxiety deplete more of certain nutrients that, like things that deplete a lot of vitamin B are going to increase your anxiety, are going to affect you. So there's a reason why we can see it. But these old wives' tales really have some merit to them. Shitty liver. Angry people have liver issues because they're not dealing with their shit. The body detoxes. Liver detoxes and removes toxins, but the toxic emotions also affect the liver, right? There's this huge correlation in Chinese medicine and in metaphysical anatomy. They talk a lot about this. I've certainly studied this for 20 years and people go, oh, that's crazy made up shit. But you can always see it always correlates. It always correlates. People who've got a lot of fear have stomach issues. Because when we have fear, when we have dread and fear, we breathe differently. So we're not, it affects our stomach lining. It affects our stomach mucus. It affects our acid in our stomach. It affects our lungs when we breathe differently. So when someone has trauma, lungs are grief. In kinesiology, lungs are equated to grief. And so, of course, then that shows up with you breathe shallowly or you smoke to shove down the grief. So, as much as people can say, oh, it's crazy woo-woo, one, look at the biology of belief. There's studies, MIT, there's university studies on this. They just haven't read them. Two, I think that it's avoidance or ignorance on purpose because they actually don't want to take any ownership. They're usually people who just want an allopathic symptom hiding solution, as in, oh, I have anxiety, I'll just take something to numb the pain, whether that's drugs or street drugs, medication, or whether it's alcohol or cigarettes, a way to numb the pain and not deal with it. Because traditional methods, and here we are back full circle, traditional methods of dealing with something are to dredge in the pain and to go into the pain. So no wonder people shove things down and don't want to handle it. No wonder they don't, because the way we've been traditionally handling it is traumatic and, by the way, extremely toxic. If you're going into this hole, this black hole of despair of what happened to you, that's so traumatic that you don't deal with it, that you've shoved it down, and then if if you go to a therapist and their technique or their strategy is to dig that hole even deeper, you're not going to suddenly find light at the bottom of that hole. And yet, I've literally seen a physical transformation with people when you say something that gets them to completely change the story that they told around it. Now, Byron Katie does this with abuse and PTSD people, and suddenly they're handling it differently and it completely works. And when you know how neural pathways and brain store memories, of course you know how it works. So, and yet, she's given, there are people who poo-poo on her techniques, but she's getting the results based on how our brains work. So, and the people who are shitting on it either don't know how the brain works or they do know how the brain works, and they've got a vested interest in people not being well, which if you start looking at what serotonin reuptake inhibitors do, you'll end up furious with the pharmaceutical companies. But sadly, with our level of awareness and understanding and enlightenment and our usual way of handling trauma, these drugs are necessary. Let's hope one day we have better ways of handling these traumas so that less and less drugs are necessary.